The starting point for information security is not an attack or a mistake, but an unquestioned premise: the users of the system are trustworthy. In the first 2 decades after the birth of computers, they were not public infrastructure, but scarce, expensive, and strictly controlled research and military equipment. Those who had access to computers were already screened, they were highly educated, belonged to clearly defined organizational structures, and had clearly defined responsibilities. In such a world, strangers did not exist, and anonymous access was meaningless. Security was not an isolated technical issue. It was naturally absorbed into the social order. Computer systems of this period had almost no security concepts as we know them today. There was no identity segregation, no hierarchical access control, and no audit logs. Programs ran in the same space, data was visible to each other, and the system assumed that operators knew what they were doing and wouldn't do anything they shouldn't. This wasn't because the designers were naive, but because there was no reason to doubt. Security at that time was more of a physical attribute. Closed server rooms, controlled access, duty rosters, keys, lists, these real-world control mechanisms constituted the entire defense. As long as people were kept out, risks were kept out. Logical attacks were virtually unimaginable in that era. This trust didn't stem from blind optimism about human nature, but was built on the foundation of a very small system and highly homogeneous participants. Computers weren't deeply connected to society, they were more like sophisticated instruments placed in corners, rather than the central hub supporting the world's operation. But it was precisely this environment that shaped a profoundly deep-seated security philosophy: security is external, not internal. The system itself doesn't need defense, as long as the environment is sufficiently pure. This concept was subsequently directly written into the technological architecture. When computers began attempting to interconnect, engineers used the same assumptions: the communicating parties were known to each other, the network was closed, and malice didn't exist. The protocol had only one goal: to ensure the successful delivery of information. Whether it would be eavesdropped on, tampered with, or impersonated along the way was never a core design concern. This wasn't an oversight, but a product of the times. However, this security system, built upon a stable environment and interpersonal trust, has a fatal premise: the world must remain unchanged forever. Once the system scales up, once the participants no longer know each other, once computers transform from tools into infrastructure, this security concept quickly becomes ineffective. Its collapse is not due to insufficient technological advancement, but because from the outset, it only applied to a world that is about to disappear. In this era of default goodwill, security seems so natural that no one realizes that the real danger is not that attacks haven't yet occurred, but that we have never prepared for their arrival. When computers were first connected together, humanity did not realize that. What they were creating was not merely a communication system, but an entirely new structure of trust. In 1969, the birth of ARPANET was never about solving security problems. Its goal was clear and extremely limited: to ensure that information could still reach its destination even if some nodes failed. In other words, it cared about whether communication was possible, not whether it could be abused. Under this design premise, early network protocols embodied an almost pure form of engineering rationality. Communication needed to accomplish only 3 things: establish a connection, transmit data, and confirm completion. Identity, encryption, and verification capabilities considered fundamental today were seen at the time as unnecessary complexity. As a result, trust was written directly into the protocols themselves. Telnet allowed remote login, while assuming both parties were honest. FTP transferred files without ever concealing their contents. Email protocols focused on whether delivery succeeded, never on verifying the sender's true identity. Usernames, passwords, commands, and data flowed through the network in plain text, transparent like air. This was not technological backwardness, but a shared assumption among engineers: the network was closed, the nodes were trustworthy, and malice did not exist. At that stage, this assumption even held true. The network was tiny, participants knew one another, and systems primarily served academic and research purposes. Attacking a system brought no real-world benefit. Security was neither a commercial requirement nor a national concern. Yet it was precisely this reasonable naivete that planted a profound and lasting consequence. Security came to be seen as an optional feature, rather than a prerequisite for existence. Once a protocol is deployed, it is extremely difficult to rewrite from the ground up. When the network began to open to more organizations, when commercial and public systems gradually connected, the trust assumptions embedded in those early designs did not disappear. They were inherited intact, becoming the Internet's deepest and hardest to repair structural flaws. More importantly, this period shaped a dangerous industry mindset. As long as the system runs, the problem must not be here. Security was endlessly postponed till later. And later quickly became an unbearable reality. When connectivity ceased to be scarce, when strangers first appeared on the network, when systems began to carry real-world value, humanity gradually realized they did not forget to install a lock. From the very beginning, they built a house without a door. For a long time, the greatest misunderstanding about cybersecurity was this: people believed that threats had to originate from malicious intent. In November 1988, that assumption was completely shattered. At the time, the Internet was still a relatively small network, used primarily by academic institutions. Most systems trusted one another. Administrators discussed problems over email. Vulnerabilities were usually treated as technical challenges, not as gateways to risk. It was in this environment that a piece of software originally written for experimentation was released into the network, later known as the Morris worm. Its intent was not to cause damage. Its goal was not to steal data. It did not even attempt to hide itself. The program had a simple purpose: to test how far a self-propagating program could travel across a network. Yet it was precisely this non-malicious experiment that exposed the system's most fatal weakness. The Morris worm exploited trust mechanisms that were widespread at the time: weak passwords, debugging interfaces, services left open by default. It did not need to bypass sophisticated defenses, because such defenses did not exist. More critically, to avoid being easily stopped, the program included a reinfection mechanism. In a real network, this design choice triggered exponential spread. Within a short period of time, large numbers of nodes were repeatedly consuming resources. The systems were not attacked, yet they could no longer function. The network was not destroyed, yet it was almost completely paralyzed. This was the first large-scale, cross-institutional systemic incident in the history of the Internet. Its shock did not come from the level of destruction, but from a question that had never been seriously confronted before: even without an attacker, a system can lose control simply because of its own complexity. This incident forced the technical community, for the first time, to take the word security seriously, not as a moral issue, but as an engineering problem, not as a hypothetical concern, but as a real and present risk. Soon after the incident, an even deeper realization emerged: the network was no longer a system that could operate on implicit trust alone. It required continuous monitoring, rapid response, and centralized coordination. As a result, a role that had previously not existed began to take shape: the Computer Security Incident Response Team. Security was no longer an auxiliary responsibility of system administrators, it became a specialized function. Incident response, vulnerability disclosure, coordinated remediation processes now taken for granted began to form in the aftermath of this event. But the true impact of the Morris worm went beyond organizational change. It fundamentally altered how people understood the source of risk. Before this, security problems were typically framed as, what happens if someone behaves maliciously? Afterward, a more unsettling question surfaced: if everything operates exactly as designed, is the system still safe? This marked the first major cognitive shift in the history of information security. Threats were no longer seen as coming only from the outside, they could be embedded within the system's own structure. Complexity itself began to be recognized as a form of risk. Yet humanity's initial response was not to redesign systems from the ground up, but to patch existing models. The goal became to detect anomalies and block known behaviors in order to regain control of the network. This line of thinking directly gave rise to the next phase of cybersecurity practice: defense systems centered on known problems. At the time, no one realized that this choice would plant a paradox that would trouble the industry for decades to come. Defense would always be chasing the past. But on that night in 1988, none of this was yet apparent. People understood only one thing with certainty: the internet could no longer return to an era of default trust. If the Morris worm was the moment people first realized that systems could spiral out of control, then the decade that followed gradually taught the world something deeper: loss of control can be deliberately reproduced again and again. Entering the 1990s, computers were no longer exclusive tools of research institutions. Personal computers moved into businesses, schools, and homes. Software was copied at scale, and data began to carry real economic value. At the same time, a new form of program emerged and spread at extremely low cost: computer viruses. Unlike earlier network incidents, this time malicious intent became explicit. Viruses were no longer accidental byproducts, but programs deliberately designed. They attached themselves to executable files, hid in boot sectors, and spread through floppy disks, shared files, and email. The infection methods were simple yet remarkably effective. The goals of these viruses were not complicated: to signal presence, cause damage, and demonstrate capability. But their impact was profound. For the first time, humanity was facing a digital threat that could be copied infinitely and spread at nearly zero cost. The security industry was forced into existence under these conditions. To counter the constant emergence of new viruses, defense thinking was quickly reduced to an engineering problem: if you can identify it, you can stop it. Thus, antivirus software was born. By scanning file signatures and matching known patterns, these tools judged whether a program was dangerous. Early on, this approach worked extremely well. Virus counts were limited, spread was relatively slow, and update cycles were manageable. A seemingly clear logic took shape: attackers write code, defenders write rules. Threats appear, rules are updated. Order is restored. But this balance was fragile from the very beginning. As virus numbers surged, structural flaws in defense became apparent. Signatures could only recognize threats that had already appeared; they could not predict the next variant. Attackers needed only minor changes to evade existing rules, while defenders had to analyze, publish, and deploy updates all over again. Defense fell into a time disadvantage for the first time. More importantly, this era quietly shaped a security mindset with lasting influence. Security became equated with detection capability. If anomalies could be detected, the system was considered secure. If no alert was triggered, everything was assumed normal. At the time, this reasoning was understandable. But it also inadvertently concealed a far more dangerous question: does the system allow anomalies to exist for long periods without being discovered? Meanwhile, virus propagation methods continued to evolve. From single machine infections to local network spread, and then to self-propagation via email, attacks began to exhibit scale effects. Security problems were no longer just individual user issues, they were becoming organizational and even societal risks. Yet at that stage, most people failed to recognize this shift, because defensive tools still appeared effective. Viruses were detected, removed, and systems resumed operation. The problem seemed solved. However, beneath this rules versus rules model, an unavoidable reality was taking shape. As long as defense depends on known patterns, it is inherently incapable of dealing with the unknown. This contradiction did not fully erupt in the 1990s. Systems were still relatively closed, targets were dispersed, and damage was largely about notoriety. But this model was carried wholesale into the era of enterprise networks and the internet. As system scale expanded, value concentrated, and attacker motivations changed, this defensive logic would grow increasingly strained. The true legacy of virus industrialization was not a specific technology, but a deeply embedded industry inertia, the belief that continuously updating rules is enough to maintain security. That belief will face a fundamental challenge in the next stage. When the internet truly entered the enterprise world, information security became, for the first time, an organization-level systems engineering problem. By the mid to late 1990s, enterprises connected their networks at scale. Email, file sharing, and business systems increasingly depended on connectivity. Risk also became quantifiable for the first time. Data breaches meant financial loss, outages meant business disruption. Security was no longer just a technical issue, but a management one. Faced with rapidly expanding networks, organizations instinctively adopted the simplest model to understand: perimeter defense. Its logic was straightforward. Define inside and outside. Keep the untrusted world out. Preserve trust within. As a result, the firewall became the central symbol of enterprise security. Networks were split into internal and external zones. Critical systems were placed in trusted areas, external services isolated in buffer zones. Access paths were strictly defined, entry points centralized, and security was visualized as a clear, visible boundary. This stage of security architecture had a strong engineering elegance, clear structure, defined responsibilities, explicit rules. More importantly, for a long time, it worked. Most attacks came from outside, and firewalls blocked large volumes of unauthorized access. Security teams maintained control through rules, ports, and logs. Enterprises finally had a visible security system. But within this success, a dangerous illusion formed: if the boundary was strong enough, the inside must be trustworthy. That assumption soon cracked. As organizations grew, internal systems multiplied and access control became complex. Human error, weak passwords, shared accounts, and misconfigurations became common, and all occurred inside the firewall. Worse still, once an attacker crossed the boundary through phishing, infected devices, or abused credentials, there was little resistance left internally. The firewall still stood at the gate, but the attack was already inside the walls. The security industry gradually recognized an uncomfortable truth: firewalls are good at stopping outsiders, but poor at judging whether internal behavior is legitimate. The perimeter model assumes a flat internal network and one-time trust. Once inside, access is considered valid. Once authenticated, behavior is no longer continuously examined. This design held in the era of static networks. But with mobile devices, remote work, and outsourcing, enterprise networks lost clear physical boundaries. Trust was no longer tied to location, and the boundary blurred. Yet most organizations responded by raising the walls higher: more firewall rules, more segmentation, stricter access lists. The result was greater complexity, soaring management costs, and risks that remained hidden inside. The collapse of the firewall myth was not due to technical failure, but to the disappearance of its underlying assumption: a stable, closed, predictable internal network. When systems became fluid, environments dynamic, and trust could no longer be granted once and for all, the idea that the boundary equals security could no longer hold. What this era left behind was not a failed technology, but a critical lesson: structural security cannot replace judgment of behavior. And the real turning point would arrive with the next technological wave, when systems are fully decomposed, boundaries disappear, and security must be redefined once again. Entering the 21st century, information systems underwent an almost irreversible shift. The network stopped being fixed. With the rapid maturation of virtualization, servers were no longer tied to specific hardware. Data began moving dynamically across nodes, and enterprise systems were freed from physical data centers. Then came cloud computing. In the cloud, users no longer decide where systems run. The same data may exist at different times in different regions, devices, and tenant environments. Network paths became unpredictable, and infrastructure invisible. For traditional security models, this was a fundamental shock. The perimeter disappeared. Firewalls relied on clear entry and exit points, but in cloud environments, entry points constantly change. The distinction between internal and external networks eroded. Systems no longer had a stable inside. The geographic and topological assumptions underlying security architectures collapsed. Faced with this shift, the industry was forced to confront a long-avoided question: if the network cannot be controlled, what should security depend on? The answer became clear and cold: the data itself. If transmission paths are untrustworthy, make the content unreadable. If storage locations are uncontrollable, ensure stolen data cannot be used. From this point on, encryption was no longer optional, it became a prerequisite for existence. The widespread adoption of HTTPS marked this transition entering the mainstream. Plaintext web traffic was gradually wrapped in encrypted tunnels, and browsers began signaling security directly to users. The lock icon became a new symbol of online trust. In this process, HTTPS and certificate-based trust systems became infrastructure. PKI was no longer a niche tool for security experts, but the backbone of internet-wide identity verification. Trust was redefined. It no longer came from being inside the network, nor from passing the perimeter, but from a verifiable, traceable, and revocable mathematical chain. At the same time, identity replaced location as the core security primitive. Multi-factor authentication emerged. Certificates, keys, and tokens became bound to specific users and devices. Access control logic shifted. Who is accessing matters more than where they are accessing from. This was a deep philosophical shift in security. Security was no longer a property of systems, but of data and identity. Yet this transition came at a cost. Encryption solved the problem of being seen, but not the problem of being misused. If an attacker obtained legitimate credentials, systems would still trust their actions completely. Certificates could be stolen, credentials phished, accounts abused. The industry gradually realized, encryption protects content, not intent. Security assumptions shifted again from the network is trusted to the identity is trusted. And history shows repeatedly that trust, once granted, will be exploited. Cloud computing dramatically expanded the attack surface. Encryption made attacks harder to observe. Logs exploded, yet incidents became harder to detect. Security systems appeared stronger, but defenders grew increasingly uncertain about what was happening inside. This phase did not deliver a final answer, but left an unresolved tension. If the network is untrusted, is identity truly trustworthy? That question would be amplified in the next stage, when attackers began deliberately persisting over long periods, when breaches stopped being sudden events and became continuous infiltration. Humanity was forced to face a more unsettling reality. Even if you trust the right identity, it does not mean it is doing the right thing. For a long time, the public perception of cyber attacks remained stuck at the level of destruction. Viruses were for bragging rights, worms were for sowing chaos. The value of an attack was measured by visible wreckage, paralyzed systems, lost data, or defaced homepages. But in 2010, a completely different signal appeared. As security researchers analyzed a piece of extraordinarily complex malicious code, they slowly realized, this wasn't built for propagation, nor for ransom, nor to show off technical prowess. It left almost no trace and ignored scale, yet it displayed eerily precise judgment of its specific environment. Later, this code was named Stuxnet. The shock of Stuxnet lay not in how many vulnerabilities it exploited, but in the fact that it knew exactly what it was attacking. It could identify specific models of industrial control equipment, verify if the operating environment met its criteria, and only then, when conditions were a perfect match, would it activate its offensive logic. This marked the first definitive turning point in the history of information security. Attacks had acquired real-world targets. Before this, cyber attacks primarily acted upon information systems themselves. From this moment on, code was used for the first time to precisely intervene in the physical world. This shift shattered the illusion that cyberspace and reality are separate. More importantly, the capabilities showcased by Stuxnet far exceeded the resources of any individual or ordinary organization. The stockpile of zero-day exploits, the mirrored test environments, the long development cycles, and the surgical intelligence support all pointed to a fact rarely discussed in public until then: cyber warfare had entered the arena of nation-state geopolitics. The security industry was forced to wake up to a brutal reality: the sources of threats were becoming unpredictable and asymmetrical. Attackers were no longer seeking quick returns. Instead, they could invest years of effort just to achieve a single objective at one precise moment. Simultaneously, the metric for a successful attack underwent a fundamental change. Success was no longer about not being caught, but about completing the objective before being caught. This mode of attack posed a fatal challenge to traditional defense systems. Rule-based detection struggled to catch highly customized behaviors. Perimeter defenses became useless against what appeared to be legitimate communication. Even when systems malfunctioned, it was often dismissed as equipment failure or operator error. The attack no longer looked like an intrusion, it looked like a part of the system itself. During this period, the information security industry was forced to confront a question it had long avoided: not all threats can be stopped. If an attacker has a clear goal, ample time, and system-level understanding, the meaning of defense shifts from blocking to detection and blast radius limitation. Against this backdrop, the concept of the Advanced Persistent Threat, APT, entered the mainstream. An attack was no longer an event, but a process. Security was no longer a state, but a continuous confrontation. Stuxnet didn't start a new era, it merely revealed a reality that had long existed but was never fully acknowledged. Cyberspace has become an extension of national power. From this point on, information security was no longer just about preventing loss, it was about control, stability, and strategic balance. And as attacks became capable of long-term dormancy, patient waiting, and surgical strikes, a much more haunting question emerged: if a system is being quietly exploited right now, how long would it take us to even realize it? When attacks began to adopt long-term objectives, when intrusion no longer sought immediate results, a previously inconspicuous question rapidly became the unavoidable core metric for the entire industry: how long does it take for us to realize the system has been compromised? After 2010, an increasing number of security incidents displayed the same characteristics. Attacks triggered no obvious alarms, systems did not immediately crash, business operations continued smoothly, while the threat silently persisted within. Security teams began to realize that they were no longer facing the question of if they were breached, but rather, how long they had been breached. Thus, a cold and direct concept entered the industry's horizon: dwell time. It measures not the intensity of the attack, but the blind spots of defense. In the real world, this figure is often counted in tens, or even hundreds of days. After entering the system, attackers remain undetected for long periods, gradually familiarizing themselves with the environment, understanding business processes, mastering permission structures, blending into the daily operations of the system like a parasite. During this time, attackers are in no rush to act. They observe backup cycles, approval workflows, and log retention policies. They test which behaviors get recorded, and which do not. They execute seemingly normal operations only at seemingly reasonable times. Attacks began to exhibit the characteristics of organizational behavior. This shift posed a fundamental challenge to traditional security architectures. Signature-based detection still existed, but it was almost powerless against highly customized, low-frequency behaviors. Perimeter defense had long since failed, while communication within the internal network was inherently viewed as normal. Encryption protected the content of transmissions, yet simultaneously masked the presence of attacks. The system appeared normal, just with a few more details that no one noticed. Security teams gradually realized an unsettling fact: the vast majority of successful attacks were not because defenses were breached, but because anomalies were never understood. During this period, the status of logs began to change. They were no longer just tools for troubleshooting, but were seen as the sole clues for reconstructing the truth after the fact. Centralized logging, correlation analysis, and behavioral modeling gradually became important components of the security system. But problems followed. Log volumes grew exponentially, while truly valuable signals were drowned out by a sea of normal behavior. Security no longer lacked data, it lacked understanding. It was against this backdrop that the concepts of behavior analysis and threat hunting began to emerge. Defense no longer waited for alarms to trigger, but actively sought behavioral patterns that did not match expectations. Security analysis shifted from "did it violate a rule" to "did it deviate from the norm?" This is a security mindset closer to the real world. It acknowledges that systems will be compromised, acknowledges that rules cannot cover every situation, and acknowledges that humans must make judgments with incomplete information. However, this transition also brought new pressures. Security teams needed deeper system understanding, longer analysis cycles, and a higher tolerance for false positives. Security, for the first time, became a task of continuous cognitive labor. The true significance of the lurking era lies not in revealing how clever attackers are, but in forcing the entire industry to admit that the value of defense lies not in never being breached, but in realizing failure as quickly as possible. As this realization gradually became consensus, humanity finally began attempting to build a brand new security philosophy. One no longer based on perimeters, no longer based on one-time trust, but built upon a model of continuous verification and minimal assumptions. After the conclusion of the lurking era, the security industry finally admitted a fact it had long tried to avoid: the system will inevitably be compromised. Not might be, not if misconfigured, but a certainty. When attackers can lurk within systems for months or even years, when the internal network no longer signifies safety, when a single successful phishing attempt is enough to bypass layers of defense, the core assumption upon which traditional security models relied completely collapsed: the inside is trusted. This assumption once underpinned the entire information security architecture. Firewalls distinguished the inside from the outside. VPNs turned external users into internal users. Authentication happened only at the moment of login, and once inside, trust was automatically extended. But reality proved that this trust was cheap and dangerous. Attackers do not need to breach the entire system, they only need one valid identity. One compromised account, one misconfigured permission, one default allow internal communication. Thus, a radical yet rational idea began to take shape: since we cannot distinguish the good from the bad, we must assume no one is trustworthy. This is zero trust. Zero trust does not mean trusting nothing, it means that no access is trusted by default. In the world of zero trust, location no longer matters. Network perimeters no longer exist. The very concept of an intranet is viewed as a legacy relic. Every single access request must answer the same questions: who are you? Is your current state trustworthy? What are you accessing? Do you really need it? Trust is no longer granted once and for all, it is the result of continuous calculation. The implementation of this concept did not stem from a single innovation, but from a systematic synthesis of decades of security failures. When the industry began to accept the assumed breach hypothesis, the design goals of security architectures changed accordingly. The focus of defense was no longer on preventing intrusion, but on limiting lateral movement, shrinking the attack surface, and reducing the blast radius of single-point failures. The principle of least privilege was revisited. Identity became the new security perimeter. Device state, behavioral context, access time, and risk scores were all integrated into the decision-making process. In this phase, security systems began to look less like lists of rules, and more like real-time judgment engines. However, zero trust is not a silver bullet. It drastically increased system complexity, raised deployment costs, and placed unprecedented demands on organizational governance. Failures in zero trust exist as well: improper policy configurations paralyzing business operations, chaotic permission models actually expanding the attack surface, overly burdensome verification processes forcing employees to bypass security mechanisms. This exposed a cruel reality: zero trust is not a product, but a long-term governance capability. It requires organizations to truly understand their own systems, data flows, and business logic. It demands that security no longer be a deploy-and-done project, but a continuously evolving engineering process. It was during this process that security gradually moved away from the stage of tool stacking and began to develop towards systemization and modeling. But a new problem surfaced. When verification points multiply, when logs and policies become complex beyond the limits of human intuition, when every access involves a risk calculation, can humans still comprehend the security systems they have constructed? Zero trust made attacking harder, but it also made defense more complex. And the inevitable result of complex systems is new blind spots. These blind spots do not come from technical bugs, but from a mismatch between scale, speed, and cognitive capacity. When the frequency of system judgments far exceeds human analytical capability, security inevitably begins to move toward the next stage. Not more rules, not finer permissions, but letting the machine participate in the judgment itself. When zero trust disassembled trust into countless real-time judgments, a new problem emerged. These judgments have become too numerous for humans to comprehend. Every API call, every privilege escalation, every instance of lateral communication, is generating logs, signatures, and contextual signals. In large-scale systems, these events occur by the millions per second. Even if security teams work around the clock, they can only see the tip of the iceberg. Thus, for the first time, information security was forced to admit a fact: humans can no longer keep up with the systems they have built. Early security was humans write rules, machines execute. Rules could be audited, discussed, and understood. But when the scale of a system exceeds a certain threshold, rules begin to explode. Conflicts arise between rules, layers stack up, and hidden dependencies form, eventually turning into a massive entity that no single person can fully understand. This is the historical inevitability of machine defense. Security systems stopped relying on known attack signatures, and shifted towards behavioral modeling, anomaly detection, and risk prediction. The question is no longer, is this a virus? But rather, does this resemble normal behavior? This step appears to be a technical upgrade, but in reality, it is another shift in security philosophy. From validating identity, to validating behavior, to predicting the future. Machines are beginning to participate not just in execution, but in judgment itself. These systems do not understand attacks, they understand distributions, deviations, and broken patterns. A single instruction may be harmless on its own, but at a specific time, on a specific device, under a specific user state, its risk value is amplified by the algorithm. This means, security decisions are beginning to detach from human causal intuition. What the analyst sees is no longer a cause, but a score, 0.82 high risk. You cannot explain why in a single sentence. You can only choose to trust it, or ignore it. This change is extremely effective in engineering, yet extremely dangerous in cognition. Because for the first time, security has become a system that cannot be fully explained. Attackers have realized this as well. They no longer seek obvious destruction, but attempt to blend into the distribution. Low-frequency operations, slow movements, mimicking normal user behavior. Attacks are no longer fighting against defense rules, but against the model itself. This has directly birthed new forms of attacks: adversarial samples, model poisoning, log pollution. Attackers do not attack the system's functions, they attack the system's ability to judge. Thus, security has entered an extremely paradoxical phase: the smarter the defense system, the more normal the attack appears. In this stage, the security perimeter in the traditional sense has completely vanished. Data flows in the cloud, identities are reused across platforms, services call each other with high automation. The true boundary of security has degenerated into a single sentence: can the system still distinguish anomaly from normality? And this question, in itself, has no definitive answer. Machine defense did not bring an end to security, it merely pushed risk control to a new level. The role of the security team has also fundamentally changed, from rule writers to model supervisors, from responding to events to correcting deviations. But no matter how technology evolves, one thing has never changed: security is never about eliminating risk, but about long-term coexistence with risk. Looking back at the entire history of information security evolution, you will find a clear yet cruel thread: every technical progress creates a new attack surface, every defensive upgrade spawns a new form of confrontation. Information security is never a history of victory, but an evolutionary history of constant failure and constant correction. If the earliest security was lock the door well, and mid-stage security was assume the door will be pried open, then today's security has become assume even the watchman makes mistakes. This is not pessimism. On the contrary, this is maturity, because a truly reliable system is never built on perfection, but on a profound understanding of failure.